Okay, for this PowerPoint, we're going to go over William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. So Shakespeare, we've talked about him in poetry, and we talked about him a little bit in our drama, British Renaissance drama PowerPoint. But just to remind you, he was born around the 26th of April, 1564, died for sure on 23rd April, 1616. He was a poet, a playwright, and an actor. And because of his humble birth and our very little amount of knowledge about his early life, there are questions on whether William actually wrote all his works. The Did Shakespeare Write Shakespeare conspiracy, as I had stated before, began even as far back as Mark Twain, who believed William could not have written everything. It's certainly possible he dictated his plays. There's also evidence that he worked with other playwrights, as many did during that time. Um, there's also suggestions as to whether maybe a noble wrote them and put his name on it. There have been queries as to whether Queen Elizabeth the First wrote these plays and then Shakespeare gave his name to them to protect the Queen. He was certainly one of her favorite playwrights. So there's evidence that lends to all of these different ideas. And a lot of it stems from not just not knowing a lot about Shakespeare's life, but not having the original manuscripts to know whose hand are they really in. So, Midsummer Night's Dream itself was written in 1596 and first performed January 1st, 1605 for King James I. And it's been adapted in many forms, including into an opera called The Fairy Queen, which was penned in 1692 by Henry Purcell. And it's one of Shakespeare's most popular plays and comedies, especially because out of all the comedies, it's n- not as much a drama of mistaken identity, that's played out in different ways as several of his plays are. It's a very unique play, plus it's got the supernatural elements that people like. So in the play itself, as you read, we have a lot that's going on in this plot and several subplots. The main plot being that of the four lovers. You have Hermia, who is in love with Lysander, and Helena, who is in love with Demetrius. Demetrius had been fooling around with Helena, and then when he found out that Aegeus, Hermia's father, would give him, Demetrius, the chance to marry Hermia and, benefit his standing. Suddenly he switches his affections to Hermia, and she is promised to Demetrius, even though she loves Lysander. And so that is the main plot. Then obviously the Hermia and Lysander trying to run away so that they can be together with Helena telling Demetrius the plan of the two lovers, trying to get his affection back to her, and then the four of them going into the forest. Now, the subplots all affect each other. At the same time, Theseus, the Grand Duke of Athens, is going to be marrying Hippolyta, who is a former queen of the Amazon warriors, who are in mythology a group of women warriors who really only need men for when they need to reproduce, but no men are allowed on their island otherwise. And they are strong female warriors. It's one of the few times in mythology that we see strong female characters. Obviously, we get a little bit of it with some of the goddesses because after he is defeated the Minotaur, goes and captures the politics to be and really because he's a very strong woman. And he actually uses music and trickery to really cheers him behind. And we talked a little bit at the end of the conflict about the difference in this was a portray. It's so about
one of he's going to get married as the Duke. It's his right to decide what to do with the Harvey Alexander's mysterious situation. Under Athenian law, Theseus has the right to demand that Hermia marry who he chooses or have her killed. Theseus gives her a third option that if she doesn't want to die, she could become a nun. Um, this is a partial blending of the Greek and Christian ideologies, because obviously becoming a nun would be more Christian ideology, even though it's set in ancient Greece. Becoming a Vestal Virgin would have, or a virgin for the Temple of Artemis, would have been more an option in ancient Greece, not which was similar-ish to being a nun, but not exactly the same. And it wouldn't have used the same kind of language. Then obviously we have the subplot of the actors. They're all common workmen, and they have formed a theater group, and they are going to perform a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, for the Duke's wedding. It is his plays and his stories and mythology. He is he tells the place and there's a lot of similarities to Romeo and Juliet. So there's definitely some that Shakespeare is the influence in the tale of Pyramus and Thisbe from Ovid in his writing of Romeo and Juliet, but here he gives the play as something to entertain the masses at the wedding. The interesting part about this subplot is that it's really a meta analysis. This is, one of those times where a play within a play, in order to talk about a play while watching a play, and that's where it gets very meta. Um, so it's this idea that by watching how this group of actors, without much support, they're just, common people, are able to set up, rehearse the play, go through about performing the play, the concerns that they have of performing for the nobles and not getting in trouble. All of this talks to normal stagecraft that Shakespeare and his fellow actors would have had to deal with as actors. So it's a very interesting meta commentary on the play process, the stagecraft process. And then most famously, we have the most famous subplot is that of the fairies. So that subplot is that at the beginning of the play, you have Queen Titania and King Oberon. They are one another, and they're the king and queen of the fairies now. They're at odds with one another. They, there was a girl in Titania who is a child, is an Indian boy, and he is very much a beautiful child, and um, kind of goes to the idea of the changeling, which is a myth that fairies, when they find a child that they want, will replace a human child with a fairy child. The fairy child will go off to live with the humans, and the fairies will take the human child as their own. And this changeling myth, nowadays with research into it, has possibly one hypothesis as to the origination of the changeling myth was children who were born with things like autism or Down syndrome, that people would explain, oh, the fairies must have switched your real child. That's why your child's different and more like what a fairy child would be. This is the origin of the changeling myth. Back to the subplot, the uh, should one of her followers. thinks that he is a lovely child and would make a great warrior and should be part of his retinue. Um, there's also partially a chance of it being like this exotic lover for both Oberon and Titania. So they're fighting over who really each other. There's a chance that they're definitely not faithful to each other. Again, this idea of the fairies being outside the realm of Christianity, they're not going to follow the same rules. So, Oberon suggests that Titania is not a theist. Titania suggests that Oberon has such a Catholic and that they both have a lot of influence over what's going on. Human. And a lot of this subplot, again, has to do with how things can be made out of the so I have no choice. Storyline that we get is for the police is trying to rehearse. The lovers are in the forest. Pop, who is also called the only character with two names. He's most often referred to as Pup, but the humans know him as Robin Goodfellow. And the um the character of Puck comes upon and thinks it's funny that this is going on, of all these lovers chasing each other and issues. His fairies feels kind of bad. Is rejecting her and she clearly loves him very much. And overall, it's decided that his way of tricking Titania, giving him a boy, that he will use and some of the gear into a presence of sleep. And the first person that she noticed is who she was from. His plan is that he'll be so enamored with this other creatures to give him whatever he wants. So, in order to solve Demetrius and Helena, because again, over on season and seems that he instructs Puck to go find the Athenian gentleman, place the liquid upon his eyes, and then hopefully Helena will see Demetrius, or Demetrius will see Helena and be fall in love again. It's a way of technically solving a problem, and it's kind of nice, but it's also very much controlling and manipulative. And of course, part of the humor comes from the fact that there are two males in Athenian garb within the forest, and Puck mistakes Lysander because he didn't see the situation and puts it on Lysander's eyes. And when Lysander awakes, he hears and sees Helena, not Hermia. And then, of course, uh, Oberon tells Puck to, fix the problem. So then Demetrius is given the dose that he was supposed to. So now Demetrius and Lysander both love Helena, and Helena at first thinks it is a trick, and then Hermia is upset because, is this a trick on me? Why are you stealing my boyfriend? And then after Puck kind of laughs at all the problems, Oberon tells them, no, we need to fix this. And they end up having to separate the two. They put the antidote on Lysander so that he'll go back to loving Hermia and leave the dose on Demetrius so that he will continue to love Helena. In the meantime, the uh, Puck decides he sees the actors and decides to mess with them. And when Bottom is separate, the Nick Bottom is separate from the rest of the play actors. Uh, Puck transforms his head into that of a donkey, and it scares away the other actors. And it just so happens that then Bottom is around to be the first thing that Queen Titania wakes and falls in love with. Now, interestingly, with the fact of the fairies, the only human who actually sees the fairies is Nick Bottom. And he's not under any type of spell that, like, when the lovers get resolved, the Oberon says that, the sleeping drought that they have put on, or the sleeping magic they have put on all four of them, will allow them to believe that everything crazy about who loves who and all the chasing through the woods, that it would have been just a dream to them. And no one else saw anything that went on. But Nick Bottom doesn't know that his head has been turned into that of a donkey, even though he can feel the ears and the fur at some points. And he sees all these fairies and he falls in love with Queen Titania. Some adaptations suggest he sleeps with her. But all of this happens and he never questions what goes on around him. He also is never, even when his head is put to rights and he's allowed to go back with the other humans and Titania cured from her um love sickness. All of this is, he thinks it's a strange dream, but he's not in the same way that the others are tricked into believing it's a dream. And he knows it really happened to him, and he says that he's going to title it Bottom's Dream. So it's very much, again, that meta-analysis of Bottom is representative of Shakespeare. So we get the fact that the lovers all works out. Titania ends up in her love sickness over Bottom, gives the boy to Oberon so he gets what he wants, and then he gives her the antidote so she realizes what a fool she's been. Um, doesn't get angry at Oberon um for tricking her, more realizes that, oh, I've been a fool, and then this actually made a fool of me, whether she realizes or not that he tricked her and used magic on her is not clear, but she realizes that she's been a fool and that um, she goes back to being the beautiful wife. Theseus, now that he and Aegeus see that Demetrius wants Helena and not Hermia, Theseus declares that Aegeus's wish is basically null and void because Demetrius doesn't want the marriage anymore and agrees to allow Lysander and Hermia to marry. And they end up having a triple wedding of the Duke, Theseus, and Hippolyta, Demetrius to Helena, and Lysander to Hermia. And then we get the short play that the actors put on for the characters. And two, we also get a lot of commentary. During Shakespeare's time, we still have young boys playing women characters. So the fact that there's some um when they assign the role of Thisbe to one of the actors, and he's like, no, no, I have a beard coming in. I couldn't possibly. Usually, once you had a beard coming in, you kind of hit puberty enough, you couldn't really play female characters anymore. That's kind of commentary on that. And it was kind of a commentary of, you were considered more feminine until you finally got your beard come in. Um, but again, we get this idea of men playing female roles. And of course, when Shakespeare originally did Midsummer Night's Dream on the stage, it would have been performed with men, young boys, playing Hermia and Helena and Hippolyta and Queen Titania and any of the other female characters. So everything works out at the end. That's one of the key things, is that in Shakespearean tragedy versus comedy, in tragedy, things the main character starts off in a tragedy as top of the world, everything's going great for him, and by the end of the play, everything has completely gone to hell. For a comedy, it starts the opposite. Things are kind of not going well, not completely as bad as like the end of a tragedy, but by the end, everything is resolved and everything is happy and everyone's set. And again, it reinforces the supremacy of the English throne, gender role norms, the power of the state and the church, everyone's roles underneath that political system. So a lot of that is influenced. All right, some themes in this particular play. So we get the theme of love, the fact that the pursuit of love will make us irrational fools. And this is something that it does, and it's not just young lovers like Hermia and Lysander or Helena and Demetrius. We see it even in the pursuit of love that Titania and Oberon are made fools of, that in order for Theseus to pursue his love of Hippolyta and marry this strong queen as he is Duke, um, he makes a fool of her in order to get it. So the fact of the pursuit will either make us irrational fools or we make fools of each other in the pursuit of it. We've all had that young love and that, and the even even not just young love, as adults, we have that love that in the beginning it's all cutesy and until it gets to the real love later on as it matures. Art and culture, like I said, we have a play within a play focusing on Shakespeare's craft, kind of the details of play playwrights and plays. So there's a big theme of art and culture. There's a theme of transformation. Both physical transformation and emotional happen to all characters. So obviously the biggest physical transformation we get is Bottom's head. That's the most visual one. We do get a little bit of a physical transformation of the gentleman, Demetrius and Lysander, as their emotions are played with by the transformed by the flower's magic, and obviously a lot of emotional transformation. Theseus goes from a hard, line person to, oh, I'm going to be a little bit more gentle because, things are working out perfectly. You have the characters with their emotional ups and downs, the four lovers. There's a lot of emotions happening in this play. There's a big theme of gender, difficult relationships, not just between men and women, but between women together and men together. Obviously, there's a difficult relationship between Lysander and Demetrius, both fighting for the same woman, but there's also somewhat, you know, especially when Helena and Hermia start fighting each other, wondering who is being tricked, you get kind of a cat fight between the girls. So difficult relationship between girls, again, pursuing love that makes us foolish will turn against our friends. Battle of the Sexes, definitely gender role questioning featured. Versions of reality, obviously the fact that everyone at the end of the play believes that the strange events, well, except Bottom, were just a dream. That plays into versions of reality. What is a dream and what isn't? Foolishness and folly. At least every single character in the play has some form of foolishness that they perform, some kind of folly. So especially think about each character because that'll be a question on the exam is thinking about all of the characters and then each character individually and listing, what is one way in which you believe they showed this foolishness and folly. Obviously, a big theme of man and the natural world, or man versus the natural world, and a big theme of the supernatural just because of the fairies. Now, some symbols, imagery, and allegory. Obviously, the love juice or the dew from the flower. The teenagers falling in and out of love quickly almost seems like magic. If you've ever read Romeo and Juliet, it starts with the fact that he's in love with Rosalind and she breaks his heart and he sobs for like a couple hours and then he's suddenly on to loving Juliet with like a deep, passionate love that he's willing to die for. So the fact of, in and out of relationships even during Shakespeare's time, it's a similar idea. Rose's thesis uses them as a metaphor to explain that Hermia's beauty and life will be wasted if she becomes a nun, and instead it would live on and her rose would bloom if she married and had children. Midsummer's Eve and May Day are related festivals. So I think we've talked before about how May Day was a usually at the beginning of summer was when the young unwed um people of a town would come and dance around the maypole. there'd be a lot of trying to make matches and trying to fall in love. A lot of that is connected to Midsummer's Eve as well. The moon and time. So the moon passes over the whole night that this play takes place. So again, the phases of the moon represent the phases of woman's life and pagan culture. And we really get all of them, connected throughout. We get the maiden through the three young women who are about to get married, Hippolyta, Hermia, and Helena, and what it is to be the young woman. We also get a little bit of the mother with Titania's protectiveness over the young boy, and we get a little bit of the crone towards the end of the play as the Hippolyta kind of accepts her position as the wife of Oberon and no longer as much focusing on the boy anymore. So those are some of the symbols, imagery, and allegory with the story. Again, there have been many, many adaptations. The last thing I want to talk about a little bit about is stagecraft. So in Greek plays, there wasn't a lot about how an actor portrayed something, changing the interpretation of the play. But we especially get this starting after Shakespeare, even into modern interpretations, because especially things like stage directions, we can s read from the text how a character is supposed to be feeling, but there might be different interpretations. If you ever watch sometime on YouTube, looking up different actors who have given Hamlet soliloquy, how they all emphasize different parts, how they all have different emotions. Some of them will race through some parts or seem a little bit more like they're thinking and contemplating a little bit more about what's going on. How some of them seem contemplative and reflective, while others seem more saddened by the soliloquy. It shows that each actor brings their own interpretation. Um, a great example, if you watch the plays for the extra credit with Midsummer Night's Dream, um, in most of the adaptations, they show Theseus and Hippolyta at the beginning of the play when they're talking about their wedding as coming together and they're in love and it's absolutely wonderful. But the BBC version shows it a little bit differently. Theseus is more of a military person, which fits the original myth. And again, the original myth, he tricks Hippolyta and he basically kidnaps her from the Amazonians and forces her to be his wife. And just having the same lines but different stage directions, different attitudes towards what is going on. You can see, again, if you've watched multiple versions, that the actors who play Theseus and Hippolyta as absolutely loving and adoring towards each other will deliver the same lines in a slightly different tone than the actor and actress who play Hippolyta and Theseus in the BBC adaptation. And yet it creates two completely different moods. And what I love with the BBC adaptation is that it reminds me so much of the original myth of how can Hippolyta, after being defeated, suddenly just be in love and totally okay with everything that's happened to her versus still being a little bit um rebellious, for lack of a better term, to fight against what's happening to her. So sometimes with stagecraft, uh, uh, it, some stage theory shows that the interpretation of the play, it doesn't, nothing from the play is changed, just the stage direction in the play. So that is Midsummer Night's Dream, and the last video we'll go over trifles.